An explosion strikes a chemical plant in central China. It's the second blast to rock the country this week. In the first presidential debate, both candidates agreed the U.S. must take a tougher stance on China. House Republicans have since released a report about how to do it. China's week-long National Day holiday has begun. 550 million people are expected to travel, despite cases of CCP virus rising across the country. The U.S. has reportedly sanctioned China's biggest chipmaker. An expert says it could be a fresh blow to China's military. And we explore just how dependent Germany's car industry is on China, after it has repeatedly ignored the country's human rights issues. A scholar argues that the dependence narrative might not be justified, but instead presented as an excuse for the industry's behavior. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. First, we take a look at an explosion in a chemical plant in central China. It's the second blast to strike the country this week. Early Wednesday morning, an explosion went off in a chemical plant in Luoyang City inside China's Henan province. According to Chinese media, a total of 30 fire trucks and more than 100 firefighters were dispatched to the scene. No casualties have been reported so far, if the official figures are accurate. According to one local, there were actually multiple blasts. After the explosions, bystanders posted pictures and videos on Chinese social platform Weibo. But the posts have since been taken down by authorities, in line with China's strict internet censorship. The chemical company is called Zhongtulihe and mainly produces petroleum products. 4 years ago, it was punished by city officials for violating work safety law. The incident comes after another chemical plant explosion on Monday. That blast also struck central China. But in Hubei province instead, 5 people were killed. China was a hot topic in the first presidential debate Tuesday night. Despite a divide on most issues, both Trump and Biden agreed the U.S. must take a tougher stance on China. Biden criticized Trump for praising Chinese leader Xi Jinping's early response to the virus outbreak, while Trump said under Biden, millions would have died. Trump blamed China for the pandemic, adding the country's official numbers cannot be trusted.
It's China's fault. It should have never happened. They stopped it from going in, but it was China's fault. And by the way, when you talk about numbers, you don't know how many people died in China. You don't know how many people died in Russia. You don't know how many people died in India. They don't exactly give you a straight count.
The Chinese regime's impact on the economy also made it into the debate. Biden called out Trump's China deal, saying it hadn't lived up to expectations.
He talks about these great trade deals. He talks about the art of the deal. China's perfected the art of the steal. We have a higher deficit with China now than we did before.
Trump shot back saying China ate your lunch, Joe, adding that Hunter Biden had a lot of dealings with China, Russia, and the Ukraine. Trump added the economy had been great before what he called the China plague.
So we built the greatest economy in history. We closed it down because of the China plague. When the plague came in, we closed it down, which was very hard.
While there were no direct questions relating to China in this presidential debate, it's unclear if there will be in the next one. The candidates are scheduled to face off again on October 15th. The U.S. has failed in its China policy over the past decades. That's the conclusion of a new report by U.S. congressional Republicans. And it gives hundreds of recommendations for countering the threat of China's communist regime.
House Republicans released a report on combating the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, on Wednesday. It's the result of a months-long probe into a group of Congress members called the China Task Force. The report includes hundreds of recommendations on how the U.S. can better deal with the threat of Beijing's totalitarian regime and assure safety and prosperity in the U.S. 60% of all ideas in the report have bipartisan support. At the press conference, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy described the threat of Communist China as one of the most pressing issues that Americans have for the next century. The CCP virus and China's cover-up were among the report's focuses, as well as the urgency of moving supply chains out of China and back to the U.S.
Our top scientists wanted to go to Wuhan to find out what was really going on. Their scientists wanted us to go to China. They wanted us to come in to help them figure out what was going on with this virus. And it was the Chinese Communist Party who stepped in and said no. We could have had invaluable knowledge about what was going on to save American lives. Lives all around the world would have been saved if China was just honest with everybody else, but they weren't.
And for decades, the United States and its allies have been asleep at the wheel until COVID-19. COVID created an awakening experience for the American people, and the sleeping giant has finally awoken.
The supply chain issue was listed as one of the report's major items. The shortages of personal protective equipment in the U.S. at the start of the pandemic were a wake-up call, highlighting U.S. dependence on China's supply chain.
We must take steps to protect these critical supply chains. We simply cannot afford to wait any longer. Our national security depends on it. The Chinese Communist Party is the greatest long-term threat to the interests of the United States of America.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney emphasized the need to allow the Department of Defense to fund experimental technology. That way, U.S. military technology can be improved more quickly to counter China's growing military threat.
And we must counter the Chinese Communist Party globally as it seeks to establish more robust logistics and basing infrastructure around the world as it seeks to project its own military power. In conclusion, it is very important for everyone to note that we are in the midst of a battle between freedom and totalitarianism. The question we all face is whether the United States and our allies will set the rules of the road into the future, or whether the Chinese Communist Party and that authoritarian, totalitarian regime will set the rules of the road.
Congressman Michael McCaul, chairman of the China Task Force, said the report will shape America's China policy for years to come, adding that the U.S. should work together with its allies.
But it's also important in this report we point out to support our allies in the region, and that is South Korea, who's under threat from China, and that is Hong Kong, who was invaded by China in violation of the UK-Sino Treaty, to Taiwan, where China parades its military, its warships, in the Taiwan Straits every day, to the South China Sea that threatens not only Taiwan, but Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. It's important that we work with our allies to win this global competition.
McCaul criticized the United Nations for being influenced by the CCP and vowed to reform the organization.
And we talk a lot about the United Nations, how China has systematically taken over key positions in the United Nations, including the WHO, which failed in its #1 responsibility to alert the world to a global pandemic because Tedros was President Xi's handpicked candidate. We need to take more of these positions back, that not just the United States, but our allies, so that the body that we fund so much and pay so much money to can be better represented for freedom and democracy.
The report also suggests requiring the Treasury Department to sanction China, strengthen its scrutiny of Chinese investment in the U.S., and sign a free trade agreement with Taiwan.
U.S. Undersecretary Keith Krach is calling on Chinese leader Xi Jinping to tear down China's firewall. Krach said in a video on Twitter, the Berlin Wall is gone, but a new digital wall has emerged, the Great Firewall of China. He compared the Berlin Wall to China's digital firewall, saying the digital wall separates the Chinese people from the free world, just as the Berlin Wall divided the German people. In a nod to Ronald Reagan calling on Gorbachev to tear down the wall, Krach called on Xi Jinping to tear down China's Great Firewall. And U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told Fox News' Mark Levin the greatest external threat the U.S. faces comes from the Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party led by General Secretary Xi Jinping. Levin then asked Pompeo what the Trump administration has been doing to combat that threat. Pompeo said first was to reverse China-friendly policies from previous administrations that misunderstood the communist regime's intentions. He said we were pushing back against essentially 50 years of policy with respect to China. He noted previous administrations had tried to cultivate friendly relations with China in hopes of the regime becoming less hostile. Pompeo noted that the strategy failed. He said one of the most important steps taken so far is to shine a light on that risk, adding it's a challenge to make sure the next century is not the Chinese century, expounding not the century governed by authoritarian, repressive regimes. Instead, Pompeo said it's vital to make sure the future is ruled by regimes with the rule of law, ordered liberty, and national sovereignty as their core foundations. Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, maintains the need for a tough stance on the Chinese regime. He said in an interview with AP, there's a need for balance in the relationship between the world's two largest economies. He told AP despite aiming to rebalance the relationship so we have fairness and reciprocity, Beijing has kept it unbalanced. Branstad served as the ambassador in Beijing for 3 years and 3 months. He's set to return to Iowa this weekend. He also noted despite the strained relations between the two countries recently, long-term ties are still valuable. China's National Health Commission announced on Tuesday that the country has not seen any new infection cases locally in the past 44 days. It added that there have been no suspected cases either. The commission claims that all new cases have come from other countries. In line with China's so-called success in controlling the virus, Beijing says it no longer sees a need for a travel ban. That's as the country's week-long National Day holiday is set to begin later this week. The holiday commemorates the Chinese Communist Party's, or CCP's, rise to power in 1949. China's Tourism Research Institute estimates that 550 million people will travel across China over the holiday week for sightseeing and visiting family. And according to China's National Railway Group, trains are expected to carry over 100 million passengers within an 11-day time frame. Former virologist at the U.S. Army Research Institute, Dr. Sean Lin, says he believes China isn't secure enough to allow that amount of mass travel. While citizens across the country have told us that local virus cases have never actually stopped, despite official reports. 10 days ago, Ruili City in southwest China was put under wartime status, equivalent to a state of emergency in the U.S. It was issued due to the area's serious virus situation, although authorities claim all new cases came from other countries. Many universities are also still under lockdown. Students at some of them haven't been allowed to leave their campuses for a month. That's as confirmed cases have been recently reported in the Inner Mongolia region, the Xinjiang region, the southwestern province of Yunnan, and in at least 2 northeastern provinces, Heilongjiang and Liaoning. Cases have also appeared in Hong Kong. Due to China's lack of transparency, the reported cases likely make up only a small portion of the country's actual infection numbers. Dr. Sean Lin says the virus is still spreading in China and that the country's zero-case claims are only part of the CCP's propaganda. Now we look to southern China, where virus prevention measures are being put in motion. The city of Guangzhou announced on Tuesday that it will build multiple makeshift hospitals to handle an influx of CCP virus patients. Large sports venues and exhibition halls will be repurposed for medical use. According to Chinese media, the makeshift hospitals will have room for more than 8,000 beds. But an update from Guangzhou's health committee claims that there were only 7 infection cases reported on the day of the announcement. Going even further, it said all sickened patients had come from other countries. The committee's vice director, Chen Bing, said during the press conference that the implementation of the fall and winter epidemic prevention plan is the priority. She also emphasized the importance of normalizing epidemic prevention measures in the city. Now we look to a Canadian court case, but with an unusual twist. The hearing held unexpected meaning for Chinese citizens and their trust in made-in-China products, especially face masks. Meng Wanzhou, chief financial officer of Chinese telecoms giant Huawei, appeared in Canadian court on Monday. The hearing featured a continued debate over her possible extradition to the United States. But the hearing sparked unexpected backlash, surprisingly over Meng's face mask. Photos taken by media outlets clearly show the words "Made in Taiwan" printed on her pink-purple mask. Masks made in China have recently come under fire for reported quality control problems, especially from other countries who have purchased them. While masks made in Taiwan have been praised for their high quality, Meng was arrested in Canada 2 years ago. The United States accused her of bank fraud and violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. The U.S. requested that the Canadian government extradite her. Canadian court documents reveal that when Meng was arrested, she had multiple Apple products in her possession, including an iPhone 7 Plus, a MacBook Air, and an iPad Pro. Meanwhile, she only had one Huawei smartphone. Huawei CEO and also Meng's father, Ren Zhenfei, was also exposed for using Apple products instead of Huawei's. One netizen commented on Twitter saying that it's their job to be against the U.S., yet they moved to North America to live comfortably, obtain a Hong Kong Special Administrative Region passport as an insurance policy, and wear Taiwan-made masks to save their own lives.
China's former finance minister Luo Jiwei warned in a recent speech that China's immature 5G technology is likely to become a failed investment. Just weeks ago, Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping emphasized the need for China's tech industry to become self-sufficient. Luo said that 5G is heavily subsidized by Beijing, but innovations are scant as no applications can be found despite hundreds of billions in investment. He also said it would be impossible to alter supply chains to meet Xi's theory, and that China doesn't have the edge to gain technological advantages. Hong Kong Economic Times reported that Luo addressed the issue during the Chinese Economist 50 forum held in Beijing. In April this year, it was reported that in China, 85% of domestic tenders for 5G went to Huawei or ZTE, with an estimated cost of $5.4 billion. Since then, the US government's sanctions on supply products to China's 5G industry has effectively strangled the industry.
The U.S. has reportedly imposed sanctions on China's biggest chipmaker, SMIC. Multiple media reports say the Commerce Department asked American chip companies to apply for licenses before exporting certain technologies to SMIC. Our in-house expert says if the administration moves ahead with a sanction, it would be much harder for the Chinese military to get its hands on the technologies it needs to compete with the U.S.
If SMIC is hit by the sanction, the Chinese regime's military supply system would suffer a devastating blow, a crushing blow. The Chinese regime's military supplies would lag behind by decades.
He added the sanction could cut off the Chinese military's access to one of the most critical technologies, semiconductors or chips. Chips power military applications from missiles to rockets, and an upgrade in China's chip-making ability gives the military an edge in warfare. That's because Beijing has been trying to build the most advanced military in the world by obtaining cutting-edge foreign technologies through private companies. The Chinese regime calls the strategy military-civil fusion, and under the Communist Party's rule, private companies don't have the power to say no to their requests. SMIC is one of China's largest and most advanced chip makers. It brought in almost $2 billion revenue in the first half of 2020. And it became China's biggest IPO in a decade when it was listed in a Shanghai Stock Exchange market this year. But the company's success could come to an end with a potential U.S. ban. That's because SMIC relies heavily on U.S. technologies to manufacture its chips. Analyst Richard Windsor told BBC that SMIC could be left unable to buy any more equipment or any upgrades for new technologies. If this were to persist for the long term, it would represent an existential threat that could see the company close its doors. SMIC denies any links to the Chinese military. In a statement, it said the company products are solely for civilian, commercial, and end users, but evidence suggests otherwise. In 2017, the Chinese military's Equipment Development Department co-hosted a tech conference in Beijing. The event shows off China's most advanced military technologies, and one of them is a chip named KD5660. Its prototype was manufactured by SMIC and is on the Chinese military's shopping list. And the ties don't stop there. One of SMIC's biggest shareholders is Datang Telecom, which provides mobile communications for military purposes. In 2005, one of Datang's research and development institutes was approved to conduct research related to military supplies. And in 2006, it won a Technology Innovation Award from the Chinese military. It was honored for an electromagnetic spectrum system that it developed with the Chinese military. Reporting by Juliet Song, NTD News.
In part one of this special report, we explored some cases where Germany's car industry failed to speak up for human rights in China. At times, it even invested in regions where severe human rights abuses were being reported. In part two, the question remains, why is the industry so soft on China? Professor Zhu Yi from the Institute of China Studies at the University of Heidelberg sheds light on the topic. She attributes it partially to the so-called dependence on China narrative. She argued that the narrative appears to be a hopeless fact and is presented as an excuse for the behavior of the government and large corporations on human rights issues. In a comprehensive research paper titled How Dependent is Germany on China? The German scholar says the narrative may not be justified. First, we look at how some industry leaders view their relationship with China. Part 1 touched on an interview with Chinese state media this May, where an industry expert who was dubbed the godfather of Germany's car industry objected to retracting supply chains from China. He stated that to decouple with China is to choose failure and the biggest mistake car makers could possibly make. He also told Chinese state-run newspaper People's Daily that they can retreat from the U.S., but definitely not China. He even claimed that as the U.S. enters into chaos, China is developing future technology. He said he believed that with the development of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the connections between China and Europe will become more important. Likewise, in 2019, the CEO of German auto giant Volkswagen stated that Volkswagen is becoming more Chinese, and that the future of Volkswagen will be decided in China. The same CEO told local media that if the company withdrew from China completely, 1,000 German engineers and developers would lose their jobs the next day. But one key question is, has Germany actually benefited from its car industry's activities in China? In 2012, the vice president of Volkswagen Group's China division told a Chinese audience that the money the company has earned is just on paper. He added that Volkswagen has only started to receive some dividends in the past few years. In fact, 4 or 5 years ago, joint ventures in China basically did not get dividends. Nearly all profits were reinvested locally. This is in line with a Volkswagen board member statement in 2018 that the €4 billion investment from Volkswagen to China comes almost entirely from its Chinese businesses. The inconvenient reality is that China's increasingly strict capital control policy has made it hard for foreign investors to get their profits out of mainland China. The country's Commerce Department has admitted they've taken measures to prevent what they call short-term speculative capital flows. This May, Volkswagen decided to increase its stake in a joint venture in China, pouring another $2 billion into China's electric car industry. Its China division chief executive said that this shows once again that Volkswagen is confident in the development of the China market. But contrary to the public narrative and press coverage, the car industry's China ties do not necessarily represent the European leaders' trade relations with China. Instead, they may have blown the dependency on China narrative out of proportion. China is indeed Germany's largest trading partner, followed by the Netherlands and the U.S. But Professor Zhu Yi's paper pointed out that the trade volume between Germany and its 4 neighbor countries is currently 1.5 times that of Germany's trade with China. But the scholar argued that never before have German business representatives claimed that the government should be cautious in its criticism of these neighboring countries on refugees or other issues, simply because the German economy depends on these most important partners. In 2018, German exports to European Union countries totaled 7 times higher than the exports of goods to China. And a late 2019 report by the German Economic Institute stated that the focus of the high percentage of turnover for some large German companies in China distorts the picture. The report also points out that between 2005 and 2015, more than 97% of the total economic value added does not depend on exports to China. In Germany, economic growth wouldn't have been much different without China. It concludes that, therefore, the export dependence on China appears limited in general. In 2014, when German Chancellor Angela Merkel asked Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott about his country's China policy, Abbott admitted that 2 emotions drive it: fear and greed. Greed after China's huge market and fear that China's power will continue to grow. It's pushed by the idea that if you don't depend on it today, you'll depend on it tomorrow. China is Australia's largest trading partner. In June of this year, Australia's exports to China accounted for nearly 50% of the country's total exports. But Australia is now speaking up over the Chinese regime's crackdown on Hong Kong, its accountability in the virus pandemic, and Chinese infiltration in Australian politics. Australia has also been strengthening ties with allies in the Indo-Pacific to counter Beijing's aggression in the region. Australia has moved on from its greed and fear, but only time will tell if Germany will do the same.